Settle in and let your mind drift back to the Victorian age. We often picture gas lamps, elegance, and order, the steady march of progress. But tonight, we step past the grandeur of the drawing rooms and into the kitchen and the busy cobblestone streets, where a grim and quiet war was waged, a war against the very food people ate. Dim the lights, get cozy, and let's begin our calm journey into the dark underbelly of Victorian consumption in the thriving industrial cities of London, Manchester, and Glasgow. Life moved at a relentless pace. The air was thick with soot. The factories demanded long, grueling hours, and millions of people had migrated from the countryside seeking work. This massive population required massive amounts of food, but they needed it fast, cheap, and immediately available. The food on the street looked enticing: a sugary bun, a savory pie, a pristine white loaf of bread, but carried a lethal secret, one that slowly, methodically broke down the bodies and lives of the working class. It wasn't just unhealthy, it was often deliberately adulterated, sometimes with outright industrial poisons. The era's explosive population growth created a massive, hungry working class. These laborers needed quick, dense, cheap calories to get them through their shifts. Manufacturers, driven by the intense, cutthroat competition of the free market, found a perverse way to meet this demand by substituting real, expensive ingredients with dangerous, inexpensive fillers. If you could make your tea go further with clay dust, or your sweets last longer with plaster, you could undercut your rival and capture the entire market. This was a commerce of quiet catastrophe. Take the humble loaf of bread, the foundation of every Victorian diet. Bread made up the bulk of the calories consumed by the average working family. The most desirable loaf was the fine white bread, which was seen as purer, cleaner, and classier than the dark, coarse brown variety. But to keep the bread cheap and brilliantly white, bakers didn't use more flour. They added inorganic compounds. The two most common and insidious additions were chalk and, more dangerously, alum. A double sulfate salt gave the illusion of a premium white loaf by bleaching the flour and allowing bakers to use cheaper, inferior, or even partially spoiled flour without detection. It also helped the bread absorb more water, making a small amount of flour yield a much heavier, more profitable loaf. But alum, while initially acting as a preservative, stripped the bread of its already limited nutritional value. Consumed daily, it caused chronic digestive issues, severe aching pain, and deep, unyielding malnutrition among the poor who relied on it for their main source of energy. It was a slow poison baked into the daily bread. But perhaps the most shocking and visceral offenses occurred in the cheap candy stalls. Children, drawn by the vibrant street life and the promise of a penny treat, were the primary victims here. Their sweets were dyed dazzling, eye-catching, almost neon colors to attract buyers, creating a palette of industrial poisons masquerading as childhood delights. That bright apple green color, used to mimic fresh fruit flavor, often came from Scheele's green, a highly toxic pigment containing copper arsenide, essentially arsenic. The rich yellow, that signified lemon drops or ginger sweets, was frequently lead chromate, a cheap and stable compound of lead. The same children who spent their days in soot-filled factories were spending their meager pennies on treats made of heavy metals and potent toxins. They were literally eating their way to an early grave. The severity of this practice was brutally exposed in the 1858 Bradford sweet poisoning. A wholesale confectioner in Bradford trying to save money, substituted plaster of Paris for white sugar in a large batch of sweets. But a supplier mistakenly delivered a sack of nearly pure arsenic trioxide. Instead of the plaster, the resulting peppermint lozenges were sold immediately. Within days, hundreds fell violently ill with agonizing vomiting and stomach cramps, and over 20 people, mostly children and young adults, died in horrific agony. It was a moment that forced the public to confront the deadly reality of their food supply. Even a simple soothing cup of tea or coffee was a gamble. Imported tea was expensive, so to bulk up the profitable leaves, vendors mixed them with dried, poisonous floor sweepings, dyed iron filings, or even the leaves of local plants like slowbush, which were then stained with copper salts to appear freshly green. Coffee, equally high-priced, was stretched with chicory, which in turn was bulked out with red clay, coal dust, or even finely ground dirt. The promise of a morning pick-me-up often delivered a dose of toxins and debris. Milk, the single most important nutrient for infants and the sick, was often transformed into a deadly concoction, known as swill milk in some cities. It was habitually watered down, sometimes to the point of being mostly water to increase volume and profit. To disguise the thin, blue look of the watered milk, vendors would then thicken it with chalk, starch, or various unsavory additions to give it a creamy, white consistency. For babies whose primary diet was this contaminated milk, the consequences were dire: severe intestinal disease and, tragically, death. The motivation behind these practices wasn't always simple malice, but rather the cold logic of economic treachery. Manufacturers were driven by fierce, cutthroat competition. If one baker started selling a cheaper, adulterated loaf, all the surrounding bakers had to follow suit or be driven out of business. The system rewarded deception, forcing even relatively honest shopkeepers to compromise their products just to stay afloat. It was a race to the bottom, where the consumer's health was the only currency being spent. The slow, quiet battle for safe food began not in Parliament, but in small, dusty laboratories, led by pioneering chemists like Dr. Arthur Hill Hazel. Hazel realized that the naked eye couldn't detect the fraud, but the microscope could. He began tirelessly collecting samples of popular foods: flour, tea, sugar, sweets, and meticulously analyzing them. Hazel's findings were shocking and irrefutable. His microscope slides became crucial courtroom exhibits, showing clear evidence of plaster of Paris in flour, copper in bottled pickles added to give them a healthy green color, and excessive iron oxide in tea. His reports, published in the Lancet Medical Journal, turned the public's quiet suspicion into a loud, undeniable public outrage. The exposure was slow but impactful, fueled by these scientific revelations, and then amplified by newspaper articles and public pamphlets. People began to realize that the impossibly vibrant, ridiculously cheap foods they were buying were literally killing their neighbors, weakening their children, and crippling their ability to work. The public, especially the increasingly aware middle-class housewives, demanded change. For decades, however, powerful manufacturing and commercial interests fought back fiercely. They argued that regulation was an unfair infringement on commerce, that their cheaper fillers were simply harmless trade secrets, and that the poor had no right to demand expensive, pure ingredients. The fight was as much political as it was scientific. Slowly, painfully, the political will finally shifted. The passing of the Food Adulteration Acts, particularly the landmark 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act, finally provided the necessary legal framework. This legislation created actual penalties for mixing harmful or fraudulent substances into common foods, giving local authorities the power to inspect, test, and prosecute dishonest vendors. The laws were not perfect, and enforcement was often inconsistent, but they provided the necessary leverage. Suddenly, the cost of being caught poisoning your customers became too high a risk for most vendors. The burden of proof shifted, and manufacturers had to think twice before adding chalk to flour or arsenic to sweets. It took decades of quiet suffering, thousands of unnecessary deaths, and the persistent work of dedicated scientists and activists to establish a basic standard of food safety. This hard-won victory was a crucial, defining moment in the history of consumer protection and public health, a silent revolution in the marketplace. So, as you settle deeper into your own quiet night, remember this: the comfort of knowing what is truly in your bread, your sugar, or your tea is not a given. It is a hard-won luxury, purchased by the suffering of those who came before us. It's the quiet legacy of the era when simple, daily food items became battlegrounds for human dignity. This is where we leave the shadows of the poisoned street for now, carrying this quiet truth with us. The reality of the kitchen. Let the world outside fade away completely now. Imagine for a moment that you are seated in the heart of a Victorian home in the sprawling, smoky city of Manchester. It is evening and the heavy velvet curtains have been drawn tight against the pervasive chill of the industrial fog. Outside, the rain is relentless. It taps a steady, rhythmic cadence against the glass, a sound that usually brings a sense of profound peace. Listen closely to it: the soft drumming of water against the pane, the distant, muffled clatter of a carriage wheel rolling over wet cobblestones. It is a world of shadows and gaslight out there. But in here, in the kitchen, everything glows with the warmth of the hearth. The fire in the cast iron range crackles softly, sending waves of heat across the stone floor. Shadows dance on the walls, flickering in time with the flames. This room, the kitchen, is the sanctuary of the house. It is the place where the chaotic energy of the city is meant to be transformed into comfort, where raw ingredients become nourishment. The air is thick with the savory, inviting aroma of a roast, the earthy scent of potatoes, and the sweet, yeasty promise of fresh bread. It feels safe. It feels like home. But as we sit here, bathed in this golden light, we must peel back the layers of this cozy illusion. We must look with the eyes of history, piercing through the nostalgia to uncover a darker truth. In the thriving industrial hubs of London and Manchester, the food that graced these tables carried a lethal secret. It was a time when the connection between the farm and the fork had been severed by the rapid expansion of the cities, replaced by a complex, unregulated chain of supply that prioritized profit over human life. The food looked enticing. It looked magnificent, but it was often a masterful deception. Look at the loaf of bread sitting on the wooden cutting board. In the dim light, it appears perfect. It is shockingly white, a snowy mound that symbolizes purity, refinement, and social standing. In the Victorian era, white bread was desired above all else. Brown bread was seen as the food of the peasantry, of the workhouse. To satisfy this obsession with whiteness, and to mask the use of spoiled, damp, or inferior flour, the bakers of the city turned to chemistry. They did not just bake, they concocted. Into the dough, they mixed alum, a harsh chemical compound typically used in the tanning of leather or the fixing of dyes in textile factories. Alum acted as a bleach, turning gray, rotten-fested flour into a loaf of gleaming white. But it did more than that. Inside the human body, alum is an astringent. It binds the stomach, prevents the digestion of nutrients, and slowly, over time, causes chronic gut. The very food meant to give strength was, in reality, robbing the eater of nutrition, creating a sensation of fullness while the body slowly starved. And it wasn't just alum. When flour was too expensive, or when the harvest was poor, bakers would grind up roasted bones into a fine white ash and mix it into the dough. They added chalk, pipe clay, and sometimes even sawdust to add weight to the loaf, for bread was sold by the pound. Imagine the unsuspecting family gathering around this table for their evening meal, breaking this bread with gratitude, unaware that they were consuming the waste products of industry. Now turn your gaze to the jug of milk standing near the stove. It looks creamy, rich, and wholesome. But in the crowded cities, there were no green pastures for cows to graze. Thousands of cows were kept in dark, squalid urban sheds, standing knee-deep in filth, never seeing the light of day. Their milk was naturally thin, watery, and blue-tinged from poor diet and disease. No customer would buy such milk. So, the dairymen performed their own dark magic to increase the volume. They watered the milk down significantly, a practice so common it had a nickname, the iron tail, referring to the handle of the water pump. But watered-down milk is too thin to fool a housewife. To restore its creamy texture and rich appearance, they added a horrifying cocktail of thickeners. They stirred in mixtures of plaster of Paris, chalk, and starch. To give it that warm, yellowish tint of rich cream, they added annatto or, in worse cases, pureed sheep's brains to create a layer of fat on the top. This was the drink given to infants and the elderly, a toxic brew that spread tuberculosis and offered zero nourishment. The deception extended to every corner of the pantry. Look at the glass jar of pickles on the shelf, illuminated by the firelight. The gherkins and beans inside glow with a vibrant, electric green. In a natural kitchen, vegetables preserved in vinegar would fade to a dull brownish olive. But the Victorians loved color. They associated brightness with freshness. To achieve this unnatural hue, manufacturers boiled the vegetables in copper pans, or worse, added copper sulfate directly to the brine. This chemical, a potent poison, accumulated in the liver and kidneys of the consumer, turning a simple condiment into a slow-acting toxin. Even the tea, the sacred ritual of British life, was not safe. The tea leaves in the caddy, meant to be brewed into a soothing cup, were often faced with graphite and Prussian blue dye to make used, dried-out leaves look like fresh, expensive imports from China. If you were to rub those leaves between your fingers, a metallic sheen would remain on your skin. People were essentially drinking lead and paint, sipping poison from their finest china cups while discussing the weather or the news of the empire. Consider the cheese, glowing with a haughty red-orange rind. That color often came from red lead or mercury sulfide. Consider the sweets given to children, sugar plums and hard candies. To make them appealing, confectioners used mineral pigments, lead chromate for yellow, verdigris for green, and arsenite of copper for a brilliant emerald. A child's treat could contain enough arsenic to kill, and sadly, it often did. This was the reality of the Victorian kitchen. It was a place where trust was weaponized. The Industrial Revolution had brought goods to the masses, but it had stripped away the integrity of the harvest. As the rain continues to lash against the window, blurring the lights of the city outside, the warmth of this kitchen feels slightly different now. It is no longer just a shelter from the cold. It is a place of hidden dangers, where the senses are tricked and the body is betrayed. In this era, before regulation, before safety laws, the simple act of eating was a gamble. You were at the mercy of the baker, the grocer, and the chemist. The food looked beautiful, whiter bread, greener pickles, creamier milk, but it was a beauty born of poison. And so, as the fire dies down to embers and the clock in the hallway chimes the hour, we are left with the unsettling realization that in the 19th century city, the most dangerous room in the house wasn't the cellar or the attic. It was right here at the dinner table. The industrial demand, the fire has diminished now, leaving behind a soft, steady heat that radiates from the bricks of the chimney. The rhythmic drumming of the rain outside has subsided into a quiet, continuous drizzle, a sound that accompanies the deep, rumbling pulse of the city itself. Take a deep, slow breath. Let the quietness of this moment allow your mind to drift back to the street outside, to the soot-stained tenements, and the perpetual twilight of the factory districts. Our focus now shifts from the intimate terror of the kitchen to the colossal, relentless engine that drove it, the industrial demand. The Victorian era, particularly the mid-19th century, was defined by an explosion of human life. Cities like London and Manchester swelled almost beyond recognition, ballooning in population at an unprecedented rate. This growth was fueled by the factories, the mines, and the mills that required ceaseless labor. Hundreds of thousands of workersmen, women, and often children poured in from the countryside, drawn by the thin promise of work, seeking a foothold in the new industrial economy. Imagine this vast sea of humanity. They were not merely numbers on a census. They were bodies that needed fuel. They were the engine oil of the empire, and they required fast, cheap calories. The long hours spent toiling in the oppressive heat of the cotton mill or the damp chill of the coal mine demanded immense energy. A worker who spent 12 to 14 hours on their feet could not afford the time, the space, or the money to grow their own food, or even to purchase ingredients of quality. Their needs were immediate, their wages often meager, and their time for preparation virtually non-existent. What they needed was sustenance that could be bought quickly on the street corner, consumed rapidly, and priced low enough to stretch a sixpence through a grueling week. This massive, hungry, working class presented a challenge, but more importantly, a colossal opportunity for manufacturers. The traditional, agrarian-based food system, local millers, local bakers, local dairymen simply could not cope with this overwhelming, centralized demand. The system began to buckle, and in the resulting chaos, a new kind of entrepreneur emerged, the adulterator. These manufacturers saw the human need not as a social responsibility, but as a flaw in the market to be exploited. If the masses needed cheap bread, the solution was simple. Make the loaf bigger and the ingredients cheaper. If they needed cheap milk, the answer was to extend the volume with water and mask the taste with chemicals. The goal was to maximize profit by minimizing the cost of production, even if the difference was made up by human misery. The chemistry of profit became simple: real ingredients, wholesome wheat, pure tea, honest spices were expensive. They required land, time, and honest labor. Dangerous, inexpensive fillers, plaster, chalk, alum, bone dust, Industrial dyes were abundant, easily sourced from chemical works, and crucially, cost virtually nothing. This substitution was the key to unlocking immense wealth in the industrial food market. Take the example of tea, the very lifeblood of the British worker. After a long shift, a cup of strong, hot tea was a moment of respite and energy. But genuine tea was costly, shipped across oceans. The solution? Adulterated. Spent tea leaves already brewed and discarded were collected from hotels and factories, re-dried, and then faced to look new. They were mixed with cheap filler leaves, such as the dried, brittle leaves of the hawthorn bush, to restore the rich, dark color of quality China tea. They were then coated with mixtures of black lead graphite and Prussian blue. The worker paid for tea but received dried refuse mixed with industrial pigments that slowly introduced heavy metals into their system. Or consider coffee a stimulant vital for the long hours of factory work. Pure coffee beans were a premium commodity. The adulterators met the industrial demand for cheap coffee by introducing mixtures composed primarily of roasted chicory, scorched wheat, burnt beans, or even shuckily dried, pulverized horse liver. These fillers offered the color and the slight bitterness of coffee, but none of the nutritional benefit or purity, leaving the consumer perpetually reliant on a chemical illusion. This pattern was repeated across every staple food. Ground pepper was bulked out with flour and dust from the milling floor. Mustard was often colored yellow with the toxic dye lead chromate. Even sweets, intended for the pleasure of children, were poisoned. Because bright colors sold, confectioners used cheap, vividly colored industrial pigments, often lead or arsenic compounds, to create appealing pink, yellow, and green candies. The industrial demand for cheap, eye-catching goods led directly to the poisoning of the working class's most vulnerable members. This era was a brutal experiment in human consumption, driven by an ethical void. The sheer scale of the demand, hundreds of thousands of hungry mouths allowed manufacturers to operate with impunity. The individual complaint was lost in the collective clamor. The worker, earning just enough to survive, had no power to choose better. If they bought cheap, adulterated food, they were slowly poisoned. If they chose to buy expensive, pure food, their families starved. It was a choice between immediate hunger and slow chemical decay. As the rain outside ceases and the quiet of the night settles over the industrial city, we are left to ponder the cold, ruthless efficiency of this system. The Industrial Revolution promised prosperity, but for the vast working class. Its engine was lubricated not just by sweat, but by deception and industrial poisons. The demand was insatiable. The response was utterly unethical. This mass substitution was a silent epidemic, killing slowly, invisibly, at the very table where a family sought nourishment and comfort. The kitchen was the scene of the crime, but the true culprit was the unbridled industrial demand that drove profit above all human cost. The bread, deception. The air in the room is still. The faint, metallic scent of the morning is beginning to seep in beneath the door, mingling with the last remnants of wood smoke from the banked fire. The industrial night has passed, and as the clock ticks towards the dawn, we turn our attention to the object that sat at the very heart of the working class diet, the most crucial caloric pillar supporting the immense weight of the Industrial Revolution: the humble loaf of bread. Imagine, The scene at the baker's window just as the shops are opening in the grimy lanes of Victorian London. Steam rises from the hot loaves cooling on the racks. The sight is an irresistible promise of sustenance. Bread was not just a side dish. It was the primary source of calories, often making up 70 to 80% of a laborer's daily intake. It was the food of necessity, consumed with tea, with cheese, or simply alone, dipped in a little gravy or soup. The cultural preference for bread was absolute, and it was rooted in social hierarchy. The white, pristine loaf was the non-negotiable sign of quality, purity, and success. Historically, only the affluent could afford the finely sifted flour necessary to produce a truly white. The poorer classes ate brown bread made from wholemeal flour, which, while healthier, was considered a symbol of low status. By the mid-19th century, every working family, striving to rise above destitution, demanded white bread. This demand created the perfect ethical vacuum for the unscrupulous baker. The challenge was simple: how to produce vast quantities of snowy white bread day after day while keeping costs low enough to sell cheaply to the masses and maximize profit margins. The answer was a systematic chemical betrayal. Genuine, white flour was expensive. It required clean, hard wheat and thorough, time-consuming milling. But the flour reaching the city bakeries was often inferior. It might be damp, having been improperly stored. It might be made from soft, less desirable grains. Or it might even be cut with ground bean meal to increase the bulk. This poor quality flour, when baked honestly, would produce a dull, grayish, and heavy loaf. To transform this substandard material into the dazzling white standard demanded by the market, bakers turned to a series of dangerous, inexpensive fillers. Foremost among these was alum, potassium, aluminium, sulfate. Alum was a readily available chemical bought cheaply from industrial suppliers, where it was primarily used as a mordant in dyeing textiles or for clarifying water. In the bakery, it performed two cynical miracles. Bleaching action. Alum acted as a bleach, turning the dingy, gray flour stark white, creating the illusion of purity, structural integrity. Crucially, alum had an extraordinary capacity to allow the baker to incorporate vast amounts of water into the dough, making it heavier. It firmed up the otherwise slack gluten in the low-quality flour, meaning the baker could use less flour and more filler, while still achieving a large, well-risen, and appealingly crisp loaf. Imagine the baker in the pre-done gloom, not just kneading dough, but stirring in spoonfuls of white powder from a barrel labeled with a chemical name. He was weighing out profit margins, not ingredients. The inclusion of alum was a direct method of fraud. It allowed the baker to sell a loaf that was mostly water and cheap filler, disguised by a chemical coating. The consequences for the consumer were devastating, yet subtle. Alum is highly astringent. Once inside the digestive system, it actively inhibited the action of gastric juices, blocking the absorption of vital nutrients like calcium and phosphates. The working class, reliant on this cheap bread for nearly all their energy, were slowly starving themselves. They ate a great volume of food, yet suffered from chronic malnutrition, rickets, and severe digestive complaints. The very core of their diet was designed to deceive and deplete. But the deception didn't end with alum. When the baker needed to bulk out the loaf further, or when the flour itself was running desperately low, they resorted to inert, heavy powders. The list of known adulterants reads like an inventory of a construction site. Plaster of Paris calcium sulfate, added for weight and whiteness. Chalk, calcium carbonate, easily sourced and white, adding bulk. Bone ash. Ground up animal bones, sometimes deliberately mixed in. Pipe clay, another white, inert substance used to increase the weight a customer was paying for. The result was a loaf that weighed its worth on the scale, but delivered only poison and indigestion to the plate. This systemic fraud was so pervasive that it became the accepted industry practice. Small, honest bakers who refused to add alum were often driven out of business because their genuinely wholesome, naturally colored bread could not compete with the chemically engineered white perfection and low price of the adulterated loaf. The bread deception was the foundational crime of the industrial food system. It preyed on the poor man's striving for dignity, the white loaf, and the economic necessity. Every bite was a risk. Every purchase was a lottery. The worker, after a 14-hour shift in the suffocating heat of the factory, would spend his hard-earned penny on this chemical concoction, hoping it would provide the strength for the next day, unaware that it was actively eroding his health, his bones, and his very ability to sustain himself. The kitchen, the table, the simple act of breaking bread all were tainted by this relentless pursuit of profit. The bread, meant to be the purest staple, became the most toxic testament to the moral failings of the age. As the first light of morning begins to faintly penetrate the gloom, we are left with the unsettling image of millions of people relying on a daily diet of industrial fillers, all in the name of a shilling saved and an illusion maintained. The silent killer, alum. The early morning in the industrial district is characterized not by sound, but by a chilling, pervasive atmosphere. The air is damp and heavy, tasting faintly of sulfur and wet coal ash. Take a slow, measured breath. The silence now is not one of rest, but the charged stillness before the day's relentless labor begins. In the distance, the factory whistles are preparing their mournful chorus. But for this moment, let us focus entirely on the private, interior struggles of the human body. We must now perform a microscopic examination of the single most damaging chemical in the Victorian urban diet, alum. We have seen how it transformed the appearance of the humble loaf, turning gray, spoiled flour into a fraudulent white symbol of luxury. But we must now delve into the far more sinister, consequent, subtle, relentless destruction it inflicted upon the millions who consumed it daily. This is the story of the silent killer. Alum, or potassium aluminium sulfate, was cheap, effective, and readily available from industrial suppliers. It was a staple in dye works and tanneries. Its chemical property is its powerful Imagine this. Alum causes tissues to contract, to pucker, and to seize. Now, imagine this foreign chemical entering the warm, delicate ecosystem of the human digestive tract. It was a shockwave delivered in every slice of bread. The working-class diet was founded almost entirely on starch, and the digestive system relies on precise chemical signals to break down this energy. When alum-laced bread entered the stomach, it did not break down efficiently. Instead, the alum actively interfered with the production and function of essential gastric acids and enzymes. It neutralized the delicate balance required for digestion. The result was a loaf that was not only lacking in nutrients, but was also utterly in. The heavy, alum-bound dough would sit in the stomach for hours, slowly souring, unable to pass through the process of nutrient absorption. This provided the deceptive sensation of false satiety. The consumer felt full, heavy, and bloated, but in reality, the body was receiving no usable fuel. It was a profound biological fraud. The worker was feeding his hunger, but simultaneously starving his body. Now, consider the long-term, agonizing effects. This constant chemical irritation led to a catalog of chronic digestive issues that were ubiquitous among the urban poor. This was not mere indigestion. This was a state of perpetual low-grade poisoning, chronic gastritis, and abdominal agony. The constant astringent action of alum perpetually irritated and inflamed the stomach lining. Millions of men and women suffered from continuous, sharp, gnawing pains in the pit of their stomach. Pains that medical professionals of the time often dismissed as moral failings or simple biliousness rather than chemical injury. Intractable constipation, the alum caused the bowel and intestinal tissues to contract and harden. This led to severe, often agonizing constipation, which compounded the distress for a person performing heavy physical labor lifting, carrying, pushing. The sheer physical effort required while battling chronic internal pain was a debilitating factor in their daily life. Systemic weakness. The worker required a vast intake of calories to sustain their strenuous factory shifts. Yet, the bread, their primary fuel source, was actively preventing the absorption of energy. This led to pervasive, bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. They were perpetually drained, weak, and susceptible to every disease that swept through the crowded tenements. But the most tragic effect was the creation of a generation afflicted by deep malnutrition and bone deformities. The most vulnerable members of society were the children. Their rapidly growing bodies have an immense need for minerals, especially calcium and phosphates, which are essential for building strong, healthy bones. Even if these minerals were present in the minimal amounts in their meager diet, the continuous consumption of alum was the biological brake that prevented their absorption. Imagine the mothers of the time, striving with limited resources to provide for their children, slicing the whitest, most expensive-looking bread for them, believing they were giving them the best. In fact, they were inadvertently participating in a chemical war against their child's skeletal health. The result was the endemic prevalence of rickets, the disease that caused the legs to bow, the spine to curve, and the chest to deform. The pale, sickly children of the industrial slums were the living, agonizing proof of alum's insidious power. The great tragedy lies in the deception of appearance. The whiteness of the bread, the very symbol of purity and quality, was the chemical signature of the poison. It was a visual lie that allowed the deception to flourish for decades. No one suspected the pristine loaf. They suspected foreign microbes, bad air, or lack of heating. The enemy was invisible, baked in. As the factory whistles finally pierce the morning gloom, calling the populace to their toil, pause and reflect on the historical injustice. Alum was not a quick, dramatic poison. It was a slow, persistent enemy that crippled the population over a lifetime. It ensured that the working class, the very foundation of Victorian wealth, would remain perpetually sickly, dependent on the doctor and unable to demand better wages or conditions. The silent killer was, in essence, an economic tool, chemically engineered to keep the poor weak, hungry, and compliant. The very essence of sustenance was perverted into a medium of decay. The sweetest poison, the morning is fully upon the city now. we leave the shadows of the adult worldly bakeries and the milk depots, and follow a path that is simultaneously more innocent and more heartbreaking. We move towards the marketplace, where the colors are bright, the noises are loud, and the temptations are specifically aimed at the young. The air here smells not of soot and starch, but of sickly sweet syrup and cheese flavoring. This is where the darkest chapter of the food adulteration story unfolds. This is the tale of the sweetest poison. The industrial cities, for all their grime and poverty, were still places of fleeting wonder for children. For a few pennies, a child could escape the monotony of their tiny, crowded home or the brutal demands of the factory floor and find a moment of pure, sugary joy. This joy was most often found at the confectionery stalls, lined with trays of sugar plums, brightly colored lozenges, and hard, rock-like candies. The sheer visual appeal of these cheap sweets was their selling point. In a world dominated by browns, grays, and blacks, the colors of coal, soot, and mud, these candies offered an explosion of vibrant, mesmerizing color. A child's eye was instantly drawn to the dazzling palette. Brilliant yellows, electric greens, vivid reds, and deep, unnatural pinks. The manufacturers understood this simple psychological truth. Color sells, and the brighter the color, the faster the sale. However, this spectrum of dazzling treats was not created with natural dyes derived from berries or vegetables. That would have been too expensive and the colors too dull for the urban market. Instead, the confectioners embraced the industrial palette of poisons, turning their cheap candy stalls into open-air chemical experiments masquerading as treats. To achieve that brilliant, arresting yellow, they used lead chromate. This highly toxic lead compound, primarily employed in oil paints and industrial varnishes, created a sunshine yellow that was irresistible to the eye. For the reds and pinks, the colors of romance and vitality, turned to red lead, tetroxide, and sometimes even cinnabar mercury sulfide. And for that shocking, unnatural, brilliant emerald green, the common additive was copper arsenite, also infamously known as Paris green or Scheele's green. Pause for a moment on the implications of this. Arsenic, one of the most feared and potent poisons in the history of toxicology, was being deliberately used to dye sweets destined for the mouths of working-class children. A single child's treat could contain enough arsenic to cause immediate, violent sickness. The consequences were immediate and terrifyingly direct. Unlike the slow, cumulative poisoning from alum in bread, the consumption of these brightly dyed sweets often led to acute, sudden illness. Violent sickness. Children would suffer sudden, severe bouts of vomiting, cramps, and diarrhea. If the dose was heightened, sometimes the colors were applied carelessly and heavily. The outcome was death. The Bradford sweet poisoning. The most famous and horrific incident occurred in Bradford in 1858. A confectioner's assistant mixed a sack of arsenic trioxide, a brilliant white powder for plaster of Paris, and used it to bulk out several hundred pounds of peppermint lozenges. Over the course of a single day, more than 20 people died, and hundreds more were violently ill. This incident was not an intentional poisoning, but it brutally revealed the dangerous proximity of deadly industrial chemicals to the common food supply. This incident, however, was merely an extreme example of a pervasive daily reality. Day in and day out, children were consuming trace amounts of heavy metals, The symptoms of slow, chronic lead poisoning, stomach pains, brain damage, learning difficulties, and behavioral issues were simply written off as the natural fate of the slum child. The ethical chasm here is profound. The manufacturers knew the toxicity of these pigments. They knew that lead and arsenic were poisons. But the drive for a penny of profit on a pound of sugar outweighed the value of a working-class child's life. The logic was ruthless. These were cheap sweets for the cheapest customers. If the customer was a poor child, the manufacturer felt they could be cheated with the lowest, most dangerous ingredients available. The bright, dazzling color was an economic necessity. The fact that it was toxic was a calculated risk that the industry was willing to take. Imagine the scene: a ragged child, clutching a single penny, exchanging it for a handful of shimmering, toxic candies. This small, fleeting moment of joy was a compact with death. The sweet, innocent taste of sugar masked the acrid reality of the industrial poison underneath. As we look upon the remnants of that era, the colorful advertisements, and the preserved jars of toxic treats, the image is one of profound moral corruption. The sweet shop, meant to be a place of childhood delight, was transformed into a silent, colorful executioner. The most horrifying offense of the Victorian adulteration crisis was not the dishonesty of the baker, but the deliberate, calculated poisoning of the generation that was meant to inherit the industrial age. This was the ultimate betrayal of trust, selling death in the guise of childhood happiness. The deadly green and yellow, the market square is awakening, and the air is thick with the competing aromas of cheap coffee, stale pastries, and, most potently, the cloying, synthetic sweetness emanating from the confectioner's stall. The morning light struggles to penetrate the ever-present haze of coal smoke, giving the scene a strange, muted quality, except for the candies. They glow with an unnatural, aggressive intensity, a false chemical vibrancy that pulls the eye. We must now fix our gaze directly upon these colors, for they represent the most overt and devastating act of chemical warfare perpetrated upon the Victorian populace. We are dissecting the deadly green and yellow dot. In the context of the monochromatic industrial city, color was a psychological escape. It was a promise of pleasure and luxury, even if only for a moment. This psychological demand made industrial pigments not just desirable, but essential to the sweet maker's success. He needed dyes that were cheap, that would bind effectively to molten sugar, and, crucially, that would never fade. Nature offered soft, delicate colors. Industry offered permanent poison. Let us begin with the chilling brilliance of the emerald green, that vivid, shocking apple green, often used for coating sugar plums, coloring cheap icing flowers, or adding a decorative stripe to a stick of rock candy, was frequently achieved using pigments such as Scheele's green or emerald green. The names sound lovely, almost pastoral, but the chemical reality is terrifying. Both are copper arsenic compounds. Scheele's green is copper arsenite. Imagine the confectioner's workspace, barrels of coarse white sugar, boiling syrup, and nearby large sacks of this brilliant green powder. The powder, a mixture of copper and one of the deadliest heavy metals known to humankind, arsenic, simply stirred into the hot syrup or dusted onto the finished product. The cost was negligible. The visual impact, immense. Arsenic is a systemic poison. Once ingested, even in small continuous doses, it systematically attacks the vital organs and the nervous system. For the industrial child already malnourished from alum-laced bread and often working long hours, The daily consumption of arsenic in their sweets was an internal ticking clock. The symptoms of this chronic, low-level arsenical poisoning included gastrointestinal agony, persistent vomiting, severe diarrhea, and excruciating abdominal pain that mimicked the symptoms of various infectious diseases, thus masking the true chemical cause. Neurological damage. Arsenic is a known neurotoxin. Children exhibited nerve pain, muscle weakness, and, over time, a profound, irreversible fatigue that limited their ability to learn and thrive. Skin manifestations. Chronic consumption often led to skin lesions, discoloration, and thickening, which were commonly seen, but rarely connected to the bright green candy consumed hours earlier. The moral failing here is staggering. Arsenic was a known, documented poison, yet it was employed because it offered the cheapest and most visually arresting green available. The manufacturer was exchanging the short-term, inexpensive gratification of a sale for the long-term, debilitating destruction of a human life. The beauty of the green was, literally, the color of death. Next, we turn our attention to the blazing intensity of the rich yellow. That deep, sunshine yellow used 4 lemon-flavored drops, imitation saffron cakes, and certain types of ginger snaps was frequently derived from lead chromate. This compound was prized by painters for its brilliant, deep color and was a stable, inexpensive dye. The toxicity of lead is perhaps the most insidious of all. Lead is a cumulative poison. It is not easily excreted by the body. Instead, it slowly builds up in the bones and soft tissues, where it remains for years, leaching out and attacking the nervous system. When children ate candies colored with lead chromate, they were adding indelible traces of a neurotoxin to their developing bodies. The consequences of this dietary lead exposure were particularly cruel because they were often invisible at first, masking themselves as developmental or behavioral issues. Cognitive decay. Lead is particularly damaging to the frontal lobe of the brain, affecting judgment, planning, and impulse control. The children of the slums, often deemed slow or troublesome, were often suffering from chemically induced brain damage, physical pain. Chronic lead exposure manifested as lead cholecalcinosine, intermittent abdominal pain and severe anemia, leaving the child pale, lethargic, and constantly suffering from severe headaches, stunting, and wasting. The body, constantly battling the heavy metal load, diverted its resources, contributing to the stunted growth and frail appearance so common in the urban poor. The deadly green and yellow were thus not merely isolated ingredients. They were components of a systematic, widespread environmental and dietary tragedy. The entire system of industrial food production had prioritized visual appeal and cost-cutting to such an extreme that the basic safety of the consumer was rendered irrelevant. The horrifying truth is that simply by choosing the cheapest, brightest dye, condemned a generation to chronic illness. A child spent their penny on a brief moment of sweet euphoria, trading it for a lifetime of deficit and internal suffering. The deadly green and yellow were the colors of profit in the Victorian age, and they represent the ultimate moral abdication of responsibility by the emerging industrial food barons. The candies were no longer food. They were miniature chemical bombs wrapped in sugar. The Bradford tragedy. The morning light, now fully established over the industrial landscape, reveals the monotonous rows of brick and mortar, the silent chimneys, and the cobbled streets still slick with the night's moisture. We have examined the pervasive, slow poisoning that was baked into the bread and dusted onto the candies. But sometimes, history delivers a shaka single, catastrophic event that rips away the veil of complacency and exposes the underlying horror in devastating clarity. We now turn to one such moment, the horrifying chapter known as the Bradford Tragedy. It is the evening of Saturday, October 30th, 1858, in the bustling industrial town of Bradford, Yorkshire. This was the night. The silent, chronic epidemic of food adulteration became a sudden, acute, and public catastrophe. The setting is the small, unassuming, sweet shop of William Hardaker, known locally as Humbug Bill. Hardaker sold cheap, popular candies, including the Humboldt peppermint lozenge, a simple white mint favored by the working class for sore throats and a moment of sugary relief. The lozenges were sold, as was common, in bulk. The sequence of events that unfolded was a perfect, deadly storm of greed, ignorance, and the lethal proximity of industrial chemicals to food. Hardaker's business required a cheap, white powder to dust the lozenges, preventing them from sticking together, and also to bulk out the sugar, thereby increasing his profits. He habitually used plaster of Paris gypsum. For this purpose, on that fateful Saturday, Hardaker sent an assistant to retrieve 100 weight of the usual powder from a local chemist named Joseph Hodgson. However, Hodgson was unwell and delegated the task to a young, inexperienced apprentice. The apprentice went down to the storage area. Here, in a grim inventory of the era, the sacks of plaster of Paris were stored directly beside a sack of arsenic trioxide, a potent, highly toxic poison, also known as daisy powder, used to kill mice, or simply white arsenic. Both powders were blindingly white and, to the untrained eye in the dim cellar light, indistinguishable. The apprentice made the fatal error. He returned with the arsenic. Hardaker, receiving the powder, mixed it into a huge batch of peppermint lozenge paste, unknowingly incorporating a lethal quantity of the poison. The peppermint oil, used to flavor the candy, was so strong that it masked the faint, metallic taste of the arsenic. The lozenges were immediately sold. They were cheap, appealing, and easily accessible. Over the course of just a few hours that Saturday evening, dozens of working-class families purchased the treats. The symptoms began almost immediately. Sudden, violent illness. The onset was catastrophic. Victims, initially children but also adults who had consumed the candies, were struck down by agonizing stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting, and severe diarrhea. The pain was described as fire, ripping through the abdomen. Rapid deterioration. For many, particularly the young and the elderly, the poisoning quickly progressed to convulsions, collapse, and an inability to breathe. The local doctors were instantly overwhelmed. They initially suspected a severe outbreak of cholera, common killer of the time, given the violent gastrointestinal symptoms. But as the victims flooded the infirmaries, a chilling pattern emerged. Every afflicted person had recently consumed the peppermint lozenges from Humbug Bill's stall. Within 48 hours, over 20 people had died. The actual number of those who fell violently ill and survived, but were left with permanent internal damage, was estimated to be over 200. The Bradford sweet poisoning became a national horror story, splashed across the front pages of every newspaper. Why was this incident so crucial? Because it forced the public and, more importantly, the government to confront the horrific reality of food adulteration, exposure of chemical proximity. It proved beyond doubt that deadly industrial chemicals were being stored and handled in terrifying proximity to food ingredients. The boundary between the factory and the kitchen had vanished. the scale of danger. It demonstrated that the practice of using cheap, white fillers, whether chalk or poison, was not merely a fraud, but a profound public health hazard capable of killing an entire community in hours. The end of denial. The sheer, indisputable evidence of death by a common sweet ended the comfortable denial that had long allowed manufacturers to operate with impunity. The resulting trial was a spectacle, revealing the entire, reckless chain of supply. Hadeka, the baker, was acquitted because he genuinely believed he had purchased plaster of Paris. The chemist, Hodgson, was also acquitted because the error was committed by his apprentice, who was too young to be held fully liable. The law, as it stood, was inadequate to assign blame or prevent recurrence. However, the tragedy's legacy was profound. It galvanized public opinion and provided the necessary political momentum to finally address the issue. The deaths in Bradford, cruel and unnecessary as they were, became a horrifying catalyst for change. The sheer brutality of the event, children dying in agony from a penny's worth of candy, was a moral outrage that could no longer be ignored. As the noise of the bustling market begins to filter into our imagined space, let the somber image of the poisoned children of Bradford remind us that the silent killer sometimes screams, and when it screams, history is forced to listen. This was the moment the tide began to turn against the hidden poisons of the industrial age. Adulterated beverages. The clock has moved past the hour of breakfast, and the working world is now fully engaged in its relentless toil. The air within the factories is thick with dust and heat, and the long, monotonous hours stretch ahead. What does the industrial worker rely on to sustain energy, to find a moment of psychological respite, and to push through the exhaustion? The answer lies in the cup. Tea and coffee. These hot beverages were more than mere drinks. They were the essential social lubricant, the primary source of warmth, and the key stimulant that allowed the human machine to keep running through the grueling 12 or 14-hour shift. The promise of a strong, hot cup was the mental reward that kept the factory hands moving. Yet, even this small, sacred ritual was relentlessly targeted by the We now uncover the insidious methods behind the deception of adulterated beverages, where a soothing cup of tea or coffee became a calculated gamble with internal health. Let us start with tea, the very heart of British identity. Tea leaves, imported from vast distances across the globe, were an expensive commodity. For the vendor, the temptation to extend the supply was enormous. The industrial demand for cheap tea meant that every stage of the process became an opportunity for fraud. The most common and widespread deception involved recycling spent tea leaves already brewed and discarded by hotels. Coffee houses and institutions were collected by unscrupulous vendors. These damp, exhausted leaves were then subjected to a perverse chemical process known as tea facing. Imagine the scene in a hidden workshop. The wet, spent leaves are spread out to dry. Once brittle, they are mixed with cheap, readily available fillers to bulk up the weight. These fillers could be anything from hawthorn leaves or sloe leaves, common hedgerow plants, to something far more dangerous, floor sweepings from the warehouse, or even finely sifted sawdust and sand. But the re-dried, substituted leaves looked dull, gray, and utterly inappetizing. To give them the rich, dark, desirable color of high-quality imported black tea, the leaves were dyed. The choice of dye was dictated, as always, by cost and availability. To achieve a dark black hue, they used black lead graphite, a form of carbon often used in pencils, an industrial lubrication. giving the leaves a metallic, unnatural sheen. To create a hint of the expensive green tea, they used Prussian blue ferric, ferrosa, and copper acetate. The consumer, drinking their tea, was consuming a metallic, chemically treated leaf mixture. The danger here was twofold. The consumer was paying the price of imported tea for cheap hedge clippings, and they were ingesting tiny, continuous doses of heavy metals like lead and copper. This cumulative poisoning, over years of daily consumption, contributed to chronic digestive issues and systemic toxicity, further weakening a population already suffering from the effects of alum and tainted milk. The worker believed they were sipping strength. They were slowly sipping industrial waste. Next, we turn to coffee. The sharp, bitter, stimulant vital for morning energy. Coffee beans were also a costly import, leading to aggressive adulteration almost immediately upon arriving in the city ports. The primary method was bulking out the expensive ground coffee with cheaper, roasted substitutes. The most benign, therefore, most commonly excused substitute was chicory. Chicory root, when roasted and ground, shares the dark color and bitterness of coffee. Vendors would mix chicory, sometimes up to 50% or more, into the ground coffee, defrauding the customer on price and diminishing the necessary caffeine kick. However, the adulterators, never satisfied with a simple fraud, quickly moved to even cheaper, more inert fillers. Roasted grain, burnt wheat, beans, or peas were commonly added, providing bulk and color. Dried offal. Disturbingly dried, pulverized horse liver was sometimes roasted and mixed in, providing a dark color and a slightly bitter, unrecognizable taste. Earth and clay. For cheap, low-end coffee sold to the poorest parts of the city. The grounds were frequently bulked out with inert earth. The most common addition was red clay or ochre, which provided the dark color and added significant weight to the product, ensuring the customer paid for mineral dust. When the worker bought a bag of ground coffee, they were guaranteed a mixture that was perhaps 1/3 coffee, 1/3 chicory, and 1/3 colored clay or burnt rubbish. The economic logic was flawless for the vendor. They sold cheap dirt and chemicals at the price of an imported luxury. The psychological impact of this beverage fraud cannot be overstated. Tea and coffee represented one of the few simple, affordable pleasures in an otherwise brutal existence. The knowledge that even this small comfort, the steaming cup in the cold early morning, was a lie, poisoned and diluted, deepened the sense of systematic betrayal that characterized industrial life. The manufacturers of adulterated tea and coffee were not just committing fraud, they were actively compromising the stamina of the nation's workforce. By diluting the caffeine and replacing real nourishment with indigestible filler, they contributed to the fatigue, the chronic illness, and the reduced life expectancy of the poor. The soothing cup of tea, or the stimulating cup of coffee, meant to be a moment of personal solace, had become yet another vector for the poisonous greed of the industrial age. The consumer paid for fuel, but received only ballast and toxins. The swill milk scandal, the early morning chill, still clings to the tenement walls. But the sounds of the city are growing louder. The clatter of carts, the distant cries of street vendors, and the low, constant rumble of industrial life. We have explored the silent threats found in bread and the vibrant poisons in sweets. But we must now enter the most heartbreaking arena of all, focusing on the essential fluid of life itself and the terrible crime committed against the most vulnerable citizens. The swill milk scandal. Milk, the simple, pure white liquid that symbolizes nourishment, growth, and maternal care across all human history. In the burgeoning, chaotic industrial cities of the 19th century, milk became a necessity, especially for infants whose mothers were forced into the factories, making breastfeeding an impossibility for many. The bottle, filled with this liquid, was the last best hope for a child's survival. Yet, the urban dairy system was a nightmare of contamination and greed. The milk that reached the city was not just deficient. It was a deliberate, two-pronged weapon against health, culminating in what was infamously dubbed swill milk. Part 1. The contaminated source and the water fraud. The cows themselves were the first victims. Unlike the pastoral ideal of cows grazing in sunny fields, the city cows were imprisoned in dark, crowded, and utterly filthy urban cowhouses, often cellars, or tiny, airless sheds hidden in the back alleys of the slums. They were fed a cheap, unnatural diet, primarily swill, the waste, mash, and slops from local breweries and distilleries. This diet kept the animals alive, but resulted in sickly cows and milk that was thin, bluish, and often mixed with pus and blood from infected udders due to the abysmal hygiene. The unscrupulous dairyman, staring at this meager, watery product, saw only an opportunity for immense profit. The first step was dilution, carried out with a ruthless efficiency that shocked later reformers. Water was added, sometimes doubling or tripling the volume of the original milk. This practice was so universal that the water pumped the iron-tailed cow became a bitter symbol of the industry. The consequences of this simple act of dilution were profound and immediate. Nutritional void. The milk was stripped of its already low fat and protein content, turning it into a nutritionally void fluid. An infant filling its stomach with this liquid was satisfying hunger, but not receiving the essential building blocks for survival. This led directly to chronic malnutrition and wasting disease. Disease vector. Crucially, the water used for dilution was almost universally drawn from contaminated urban sources, wells and pumps situated perilously close to cesspools, overflowing drains, and burial grounds. The polluted water, teeming with bacteria, turned the milk into a perfect, warm, fatty culture medium for deadly pathogens. Diseases like typhoid, scarlet fever, and tuberculosis were efficiently distributed through the entire community on a daily basis, delivered directly to the most vulnerable recipients. Part 2. The chemical masquerade of creaminess. The watered-down product was pale, thin, and suspicious look. The consumer, paying a premium price for milk, demanded the rich, opaque whiteness and viscosity that signaled quality. This forced the dairyman into the second, more cynical stage: the chemical restoration of the illusion of creaminess. Since they could not replace the expensive butterfat, they replaced the appearance of butterfat with cheap, inert, and often dangerous mineral fillers. Imagine the churning room, where the liquid was mixed with a horrifying inventory of industrial dusts. Chalk, calcium carbonate, added to restore the opaque, pristine, white color. It offered zero nourishment and often created severe digestive blockages. Plaster of Paris, calcium sulfate, stirred in to give the liquid a false body and thickness, preventing the watery solution from separating easily. Starch, flour, and dextrin, cooked starch paste, was incorporated to create a viscous, creamy texture in the mouth, simulating the richness of fat. The unspeakable. In the most extreme and documented cases, the need to create a fatty cream line that would rise to the top of the bottle led to the inclusion of animal byproducts, pureed sheep's brains, or other pulverized offal from the cheap slaughterhouses. were alleged to be mixed in to supply a layer of false cream, a final, sickening touch to the deception. To complete the visual lie, if the milk was still too blue, it might be lightly tinged with coloring, sometimes turmeric, but often chemical dyes do simulate the yellow hue of true cream. The death sentence and the human cost. The result was a fluid that, for the working class infant, became a virtual death sentence. Historical records show a devastating correlation between the urban milk supply and infant mortality rates. A child who was fed this swill milk was battling two forces simultaneously: slow starvation from lack of nutrients, and acute bacterial infection from contaminated water and unhygienic storage. The children died from summer diarrhea, wasting, or consumption euphemisms that masked the true cause: systematic food poisoning. This scandal was not merely a fraud against the wallet. It was an act of profound social violence against the future generation. The mothers, desperate to sustain their children, were forced to rely on a commercial system that had utterly betrayed its most sacred trust. The swill milk scandal stands as the most damning evidence of the ethical rot that permeated the industrial food chain. It demonstrated a cold, calculated willingness to sacrifice thousands of innocent lives for the marginal profit gained by adding water and chalk to a gallon of milk. This crime, carried out day after day, drop by drop, ensured that the poor remained sickly, weak, and dependent, confirming that in the unbridled pursuit of industrial wealth, even the most fundamental human right, the right to clean nourishment, could be chemically usurped. Economic treachery. Let the relentless drumming of the industrial machinery fade for a moment. Close your eyes and listen not to the noise of the factories, but to the silence of the ledger books, the cold, stark language of economics that truly governed the kitchens of Victorian Britain. We have viewed the adulterator as a villain, but now we must understand him as a product of his environment, a pawn in a larger, more ruthless game. The driving force behind the systematic poisoning of the population was not simple malice. It was the chilling, impersonal logic of economic treachery. The Victorian market, during the explosive period of industrialization, was defined by two overwhelming realities: an enormous, concentrated population of working poor, and an environment of near absolute laissez-faire. Capitalism. The vast working class needed calories, and they needed them at the absolute lowest price possible. If a baker charged 3 pennies for a loaf, and his competitor found a way to charge 2.5, the choice for the financially desperate customer was made instantly. This created a cutthroat, competitive dynamic where the survival of a small business depended entirely on its ability to undercut its rivals. Quality became a prohibitive expense. Fraud became a necessity for solvency. Consider the dilemma of the small, independent retailer, the local grocer, the neighborhood baker. He was a man with a family, bills, and rent, and he was staring down the barrel of economic ruin. He knew the cost of pure, high-quality flour. He knew the cost of genuinely unwatered milk. He wanted to be honest, but his competitor, driven by the same economic anxieties, had already crossed the line. If one butcher started selling inferior meat, others had to follow suit or be driven out of business. Imagine the butcher's stall. His honest beef is selling for 9 pence a pound. The butcher down the street begins to sell a cheaper product for 8 pence. How? By buying older, poorer quality carcasses, by trimming the fat closer, and perhaps by adding cheap, heavy fillers to his sausages, like coarse bone dust or potato flour. Every working-class family, budgeting their precious shillings, is immediately drawn to the 8-penny option. The honest butcher's stock begins to spoil. He sees his customers disappearing. He has a terrifying choice: ruin or replication. If he chooses ruin, his family is cast into the abyss of the workhouse. If he chooses replication, he reluctantly begins to adopt the methods of his competitor, dousing his old meat with saltpeter or borax to make it look fresh, or secretly adding water to the fat content to increase the weight he sells. He is not motivated by a desire to kill. He is motivated by a desperate desire to survive. This pressure was systemic, infecting every commodity. The tea merchant. If genuine tea costs 2 shillings and a rival mixed his supply with cheap, homegrown hawthorn leaves and graphite to sell it for 1 shilling and 9 pence, the honest tea merchant faced a 15% price disadvantage he could not overcome without resorting to dyeing his own stock. The spice grinder. Pure spices were expensive. If one grinder introduced sand or ground nutshells to his pepper, doubling his weight for negligible cost, the honest grinder's selling pure pepper became instantly uncompetitive. The tragedy here lies in the failure of the market mechanism. The market's supposed intelligence, the idea that consumers will always choose quality, collapsed under the weight of working-class poverty. When a person is desperate, they can only afford to buy the price, not the product. The demand for cheapness created a supply chain where the only sustainable business model was fraud. The consumer, in a strange irony, was also an unwitting agent of the treachery. The market demanded a premium appearance at a pauper price. The consumer wanted white bread, the symbol of status, but they only had money for cheap flour. The baker was forced to use alum to create the illusion of whiteness, thereby satisfying the social aspiration while simultaneously destroying the food's nutritional value. The market demanded the visual lie, and the manufacturer was the one who profited by chemically delivering it. Furthermore, the lack of effective regulation cemented the fraud as standard practice, since adulteration was treated merely as a minor financial offense. The fines were negligible fraction of the profits gained from the fraud. The economic calculus for the manufacturer was brutally simple. The risk of being caught and fined was far less than the guaranteed profit from selling a cheaper, adulterated product. The law failed to create a disincentive to poisoning. It effectively subsidized it. This complex web of economic treachery shows that the food crisis was not about individual moral decay, but about a deeply flawed structure. The industrial machine was an engine that required constant refueling of the workforce. When the cost of honest fuel became too high, the system automatically substituted it with cheap, toxic sludge. The manufacturer, who remained honest, was simply replaced by one who was willing to participate in the collective deceit. The entire system was rigged, and the daily consumption of poison became the terrible hidden cost of industrial competitiveness. The quiet, analytical truth is that in the Victorian age, honesty was simply too expensive to survive in the industrial food chain. The chemists stand. Let the clamor of the marketplace recede entirely now. We move away from the noise of the hawkers and the clatter of the mills, seeking the sanctuary of science. The stage of our story shifts to a small, quiet room in London, illuminated not by the yellow flicker of a gas lamp, but by the steady, focused light necessary for meticulous observation. This room houses the instrument that would finally break the power of the poisoners: the microscope. The silent battle for safe food began here. A revolution led by the pioneers of science, the chemists. For decades, the victims of food adulteration had suffered in silence. The poor complained of crippling abdominal pain. The children were afflicted with wasting diseases and rickets. But these were dismissed by the powerful as the natural squalor of poverty. The manufacturers, protected by their wealth and the invisibility of their crime, operated with impunity. A person could complain that their bread tasted metallic or their tea felt gritty, but they could not prove it. The challenge was scientific: how to transform anecdotal rumor into unassailable visual fact. The first attempt, as we noted, came from the passionate chemist Frederick Acum, whose Iba Arlene exposed there is death in the pot shocked the public but failed to sustain legal action. Acum relied on corrosive chemical tests to prove the presence of deadly elements like copper or lead. However, these tests were often complex, the results debatable in court, and easily countered by the powerful industry lawyers who simply claimed accidental contamination. Acum proved the chemistry of the poison. What was needed was the undeniable proof of the physical fraud. This is where Dr. Arthur Hill Hazel, 1817 to 1894, stepped forward. Hazel, a physician and dedicated sanitary reformer, recognized the limitation of chemical tests. He realized that the primary fraud was not just the use of poison, but the bulking out of expensive foodstuffs with cheap, inert fillers. These fillers chalk, sand, rice, meal, ground bone were physical lies, and they required a physical witness. That witness was the newly refined, powerful compound microscope. Beginning his work in the late 1840s, Hazel instituted a methodical, scientific investigation unparalleled in its time. He purchased samples of every staple food from across London, carefully noting the vendor and the price. Then, in the quiet discipline of his laboratory, he prepared his slides. Imagine the tedious, meticulous work: grinding a piece of bread into a fine powder, suspending a few grains of coffee in glycerin, or carefully separating a pinch of tea leaves. He then placed them under the lens. What Hazel saw under that lens was a universe of betrayal. He was the first to definitively prove, visually, the systematic nature of the fraud. Bread and flour. Hazel could instantly identify the genuine, distinct, oval-shaped starch granules of pure wheat. He could then compare them to the foreign, easily distinguishable starches used as fillers, the smaller, rounded granules of potato starch, or the large, angular fragments of rice meal. More damningly, he could see the telltale crystalline shards of alum and the rough, inorganic lumps of plaster of Paris, and chalk indisputable evidence of deliberate, non-nutritious adulteration. Coffee. Under the microscope, pure coffee grounds appear as a homogeneous, fibrous texture. Hazel's slides, however, revealed the coarse, rectangular cells of roasted chicory root, the dense, cooked tissue of burnt cereals, and, most damningly, the sharp, abrasive, irregular particles of red clay and sand, proof that customers were paying for dirt. Spices. Pure spices show distinct cell structures. Hazel showed that pepper was adulterated with ground nutshells and the gritty, insoluble particles of mineral earth. Mustard was dyed with lead chromate, a dangerous industrial paint, easily visible as tiny, intensely colored metallic flakes. Hazel's genius was in transforming scientific data into public knowledge. From 1850 to 1854, he published his reports in The Lancet under the title Food and Its Adulterations. Crucially, he did not stop at text. He included detailed, exquisite lithographic illustrations of his microscopic findings. This visual evidence was the silver bullet that shattered the industry's defense. No longer could a baker claim that the white powder in his flour was merely an accidental impurity. The illustration showed the crystalline structure of a lemma, known industrial chemical in stark, undeniable clarity. It converted a theoretical suspicion into a visible, tangible fact. It gave the public, and more importantly, the reformers in Parliament, the moral and factual ammunition they desperately needed. The impact of Hazel's work was immense. It was the scientific catalyst that led to mass awareness and political action. His microscope provided the first irrefutable, unbiased witness to the crime. It forced the government to acknowledge that the problem was not one of isolated bad actors, but a systemic failure of the entire food supply chain, perpetuated by greed and facilitated by a lack of regulation. The stand taken by Hazel and his peers was an act of profound civil courage. They risked libel suits and professional ostracization by naming and shaming the specific types of fraud. But by holding up the lens of the microscope, they effectively said to the industrial giants, "Your fraud is invisible no more. We see the sand, we see the chalk, and we see the poison." The war for food safety was truly won in the quiet solitude of the laboratory, armed with the power of scientific truth. Hazel's revelations, the transition from scientific discovery to public disclosure, is often the most dangerous and decisive phase of any moral crusade. Dr. Arthur Hazel had armed himself with truth in his laboratory, but he faced the terrifying task of making that truth undeniable, unforgettable, and politically explosive to a nation steeped in commercial denial. We now examine the shattering impact of Hazel's revelations. The moment the silent epidemic of adulteration was dragged, screaming, into the public light. Hazel's genius lay not just in his microscopic technique, but in his rigorous, systematic approach to data collection and publication. His 4-year series of reports in the Lancet 1850 to 1854 constituted a devastating, itemized indictment of the entire food supply chain. The sheer volume and consistency of his findings made them impossible to dismiss as mere isolated incidents or accidents. They proved a systematic, national conspiracy of chemical betrayal. The reports were particularly effective because they used the visual clarity of the microscope to expose lies that had previously been hidden behind complex chemical nomenclature. Hazel didn't just tell the public about copper. He showed them where the copper was a microscopic piece of evidence that brought the crime into focus. His method turned the humble microscope slide into a courtroom exhibit, forcing the public to confront the horrifying reality of what they were consuming daily. The unmasking of physical fraud, bread and flour, most potent and emotionally charged deception was the adulteration of bread, the staff of life. While chemists had long suspected the presence of alum, Hazel's microscope provided the incontrovertible proof of physical intentional addition of weight and false texture. Plaster of Paris and chalk, Hazel's slides revealed the sharp, irregular, non-digestible fragments of plaster of Paris, calcium sulfate, and common chalk, calcium carbonate, mixed liberally into white flour. This was the final, humiliating proof that the poorest consumers were paying for food that was literally a mixture of grain and construction materials. The consumption of these inert minerals offered no nourishment, created digestive blockages, and represented a direct financial swindle. Foreign starches, by comparing the distinctive cellular structure of pure wheat starch to the granules of cheaper substitutes, such as the large, easily identifiable starch cells from potatoes or the uniform granules of rice meal, Hazel proved the financial fraud that replaced nutritious components with low-value fillers. The exposure of color poisoning. Preserved goods and sweets. Hazel's work confirmed the terrifying link between visual appeal and toxicity, particularly in preserved goods and sweets, where manufacturers prioritize dazzling color above all else. Copper in pickles and vegetables. The intensely vibrant, unnatural green of many bottled pickles and canned peas was shown to be the result of adding copper sulfate or boiling the vegetables in copper vessels. Hazel's tests confirmed the presence of toxic copper compounds, a metal that accumulates in the liver, added purely to satisfy the consumer's demand for an aesthetically perfect green. Lead in confectionery and curry powder. The rich yellow colors in cheap sweets, curds, and even some highly spiced curry powders were found to contain lead chromate. This revelation was particularly shocking as it meant children were continuously ingesting lead, a potent neurotoxin known to cause irreversible brain damage and chronic lead colic, severe abdominal pain. The pursuit of a cheap, bright yellow was literally sacrificing the neurological health of a generation. The filth in the stimulants, tea and coffee even. The small daily rituals meant for comfort were found to be riddled with filth and chemical deception. Iron oxide in tea. Hazel's microscopic inspection of common tea packets showed that the tea was not merely spent and re-dried, but that the leaves were treated with black lead graphite or iron oxide rust to restore a deep black color and add significant weight. He proved the worker was consuming metallic dust, clay and dirt in coffee. His slides of coffee powder provided the most graphic evidence of physical contamination. He documented the presence of red clay ochre, sand, roasted horse liver, and burnt beans, showing the customer was paying premium import prices for mineral dirt and OFFAL. The profound impact of Hazel's revelations transcended the medical field. The reports were picked up and sensationalized by the popular press, transforming a quiet medical inquiry into a deafening public outrage. The sheer, undeniable clarity of the illustrated microscopic evidence made every middle-class and working-class reader question the integrity of every item on their table. The quiet suspicion that had festered for decades erupted into loud, collective demand for protection. Hazel's meticulous work provided the necessary factual bedrock for legislative change. The reformers and politicians who had previously been outmaneuvered by the wealthy industry lobby now had unimpeachable scientific proof. His commitment to bringing the truth from the specialized lab to the public eye was the single most important factor in shifting the momentum from the adulterators to the advocates of public health. The battle was no longer one of rumor versus denial. It was one of established science versus criminal greed. The Victorian public realized they had been living in a state of chemical vulnerability, and the microscopic lens had finally granted them the vision to fight back. Public awareness. Public awareness did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It crept forward slowly, unevenly, carried not by official announcements, but by ink, paper, and whispered conversations. In cramped newspaper columns, between advertisements for soap and railway tickets, short articles began to appear, reports of unexplained illnesses, suspicious deaths, and troubling laboratory findings. At first, most readers skimmed past them. Industrial life was already full of danger. Smoke choked the air, machines mangled limbs, disease stalked the alleys. A little bad food hardly seemed remarkable. But the stories did not stop. Week after week, similar reports surfaced in different cities, describing the same patterns with unsettling familiarity. Children falling ill after eating brightly colored sweets. Entire households weakened by daily staples like bread or milk. Coroners' inquests hinting at poison without naming it outright. Slowly, the idea took root that these were not isolated tragedies, but fragments of a larger, darker picture. Pamphlets played a crucial role in this awakening. Cheap to print and easy to distribute, they circulated through churches, lecture halls, markets, and factory gates. Written in plain language, they explained what newspapers often softened, that many everyday foods were deliberately adulterated with substances known to harm the human body. These pamphlets did not rely solely on outrage. They offered evidence, chemical names, test results, case studies presented carefully enough to be understood by ordinary readers. For many, this was the first time science entered their kitchens. Words like alum, copper, and arsenic escaped laboratories and entered common speech. Housewives discussed them while shopping. Workers mentioned them during breaks. Parents repeated them with fear and anger when their children complained of stomach pain or dizziness. Knowledge, once the domain of specialists, began to spread through daily life. The emotional impact was profound. Hunger was one thing. Betrayal was another. People had accepted hardship as the price of industrial progress, but poisoning felt different. To discover that food, something associated with care, family, and survival, had become a source of danger, struck at a deep sense of injustice. The realization that neighbors had died not from fate or weakness, but from preventable deception, ignited a new kind of anger. Children became the center of this awareness. Newspaper illustrations showed pale, thin faces beside descriptions of adulterated sweets and milk. Stories emphasized innocence and vulnerability, making it impossible to dismiss the issue as personal responsibility or bad choices. When parents began to suspect that the treats they bought to comfort their children were harming them, outrage replaced resignation. Food adulteration stopped being an abstract problem and became a moral one. Public lectures amplified this shift. Reformers rented halls and invited audiences to watch live demonstrations. Bread was tested before their eyes, revealing chalk and chemicals. Milk was boiled down to show how little of it was real. These moments were powerful because they transformed invisible dangers into visible proof. People left such lectures shaken, carrying both knowledge and fear back into their communities. The press responded to growing interest with more detailed investigations. Journalists followed supply chains, interviewed chemists, and exposed specific practices. Some named Scupanis directly, risking lawsuits and retaliation. Others focused on patterns rather than individuals, describing an industry culture that rewarded deception. Serialized articles kept readers engaged over weeks and months, ensuring the issue did not fade quickly from attention. Not everyone welcomed this awareness. Shopkeepers complained that customers had become suspicious and demanding. Manufacturers accused newspapers of exaggeration and hysteria. Some editors, dependent on advertising revenue from food producers, hesitated to publish critical pieces. As a result, public awareness spread unevenly, stronger in some cities, weaker in others, shaped by local politics and economics. Among the working class, reactions were complex. Fear mingled with helplessness. Knowing that food was dangerous did not always provide alternatives. People still needed to eat, still had limited budgets, still depended on the same markets. Awareness did not immediately change behavior, but it changed perception. Meals were no longer taken for granted. Each loaf of bread, each cup of milk, carried a quiet question mark. Women emerged as key carriers of this new consciousness. Through household networks, charity groups, and informal gatherings, They shared information and warnings. Advice circulated about which shops to trust, which foods to avoid, which signs might indicate adulteration. Though these strategies were imperfect, they represented a collective attempt to regain control in a system designed to deny it. Religious and moral leaders added their voices, framing adulteration as a sin against the vulnerable. Sermons condemned those who profited by harming the poor, especially children. This moral framing resonated deeply in communities accustomed to interpreting suffering through ethical lenses. The issue moved beyond health and economics into questions of right and wrong. Still, disbelief lingered. For some, the idea that everyday foods were poisoned seemed too extreme to accept. Generations had survived on these diets. They argued, how could something so common be so dangerous? Manufacturers exploited this doubt, emphasizing uncertainty and downplaying risk. The battle for public awareness was not just about spreading information, but about overcoming denial. Gradually, numbers replaced anecdotes. Reports began to compile statistics showing higher illness rates in areas known for heavy adulteration. Patterns became harder to dismiss. Medical professionals, once cautious, spoke more openly. There, authority lent weight to what pamphlets and newspapers had been saying all along. The sense that something was fundamentally wrong grew harder to ignore. This awareness also reshaped conversations about poverty. Illness was no longer seen solely as a result of moral failing or weak character. Dialogue, overlooked or blamed on personal choice, was recognized as structurally compromised. The poor were not merely eating badly. They were being sold bad food. This shift challenged deeply ingrained prejudices and forced society to reconsider who bore responsibility for suffering. As awareness spread, so did frustration with inaction. People asked why, if the problem was so well known, it continued unchecked. Letters to editors demanded answers. Public meetings passed resolutions. The idea that knowledge alone was insufficient began to take hold. Awareness created expectational accountability, of protection, of change. Importantly, this awakening was not uniform or complete. Many remained unaware, unconvinced, or resigned. Industrial life left little time for sustained outrage. Yet even partial awareness altered the landscape. It created pressure, however uneven, on officials and manufacturers. Silence became harder to maintain. By the time lawmakers seriously debated stronger regulation, public awareness had already done much of the work. It had transformed food adulteration from a hidden practice into a recognized threat. It had put phases spatially, children's phases on abstract data. It had reframed cheap, vibrant foods not as blessings of progress, but as potential instruments of harm. This awareness did not resolve the problem. It did not immediately clean the markets or heal the sick, but it changed the direction of the story. Once people began to see the connection between their neighbors' suffering and the contents of their plates, indifference became more difficult to sustain. The exposure was slow, fragmented, and contested, but it was irreversible. Knowledge had entered public life, and with it came a demand that would not disappear quietly. What remained uncertain was how that demand would be answered, and whether awareness alone could force a system built on profit and neglect to finally change. The fight for reform for decades. The struggle to reform the food system unfolded not in kitchens or markets, but in courtrooms, council chambers, newspapers, and pamphlets. As evidence of widespread adulteration mounted, so did resistance from those who profited most from it. Powerful manufacturers, wholesalers, and trade associations pushed back fiercely. framing regulation not as protection for the public, but as an attack on commerce itself. They insisted that government interference threatened innovation, economic stability, and the very freedom on which industrial progress depended. Their arguments were carefully crafted and relentlessly repeated. Food adulteration, they claimed, was exaggerated by alarmists and moral crusaders who did not understand the realities of mass production. Small additives, they argued, were necessary to keep food affordable for the poor. Without them, prices would rise, wages would not keep pace, and hunger would worsen. In this logic, reformers were not defenders of the working class, but its enemies, well-meaning idealists willing to sacrifice livelihoods for purity. Central to this defense was the idea of the trade secret. Manufacturers insisted that their recipes, methods, and additives were proprietary knowledge, the result of experience and innovation. To force disclosure, they said, would be to steal intellectual property. What went into bread, milk, or sweets was not the public's concern. What mattered was that the product sold and satisfied demand. As long as customers continued to buy, the system was working. Many adulterants were described as harmless, even beneficial. Alum was defended as a baking aid. Chalk was dismissed as a natural mineral. Dyes were praised for improving appearance, making food more appealing and reducing waste. When reformers pointed to illness and long-term harm, manufacturers countered with uncertainty. Where was the proof, they asked, that these substances caused real damage? In an age before widespread medical statistics, doubt was a powerful weapon. The legal landscape favored industry. Existing laws were vague, outdated, or focused on fraud rather than health. Prosecuting adulteration required proving intent to deceive, a difficult task when sellers could argue ignorance or industry norms. Even when cases succeeded, penalties were often small fines that amounted to little more than the cost of doing business. For large manufacturers, punishment was simply another expense. Reformers faced not only legal barriers, but social ones. Many were dismissed as elitists who could afford better food and now sought to impose their standards on the poor. Others were accused of undermining British industry at a time when global competition was intensifying. Newspapers, friendly to commerce, painted regulation as foreign, unmanly, or dangerously radical. Public opinion, fragmented and weary, was slow to mobilize. Yet the fight continued, driven by a growing coalition of doctors, chemists, journalists, and social reformers. They collected samples, ran experiments, and published results that were difficult to ignore. Tables of data replaced anecdotes. Patterns emerged. Certain illnesses clustered around certain foods. Certain neighborhoods suffered disproportionately. What had once seemed like isolated incidents began to look like a systemic problem. Public demonstrations of food testing became powerful tools. Reformers held lectures where bread was chemically analyzed before live audiences, revealing chalk and alum in everyday loaves. Milk was evaporated to show how little of it was real. These performances transformed invisible dangers into undeniable facts. The kitchen table became a site of political concern, and the contents of a loaf of bread became a matter of public debate. Manufacturers responded by refining their rhetoric. They accused reformers of fear-mongering and damaging trust. Some introduced voluntary standards and seals of quality, attempting to appear responsible without submitting to binding laws. Others quietly adjusted practices, replacing the most dangerous additives with slightly less harmful ones, while continuing to oppose regulation in principle. The system adapted just enough to survive. Inside government, the debate was slow and cautious. Lawmakers feared backlash from industry and unrest from workers if food prices rose. Committees were formed, reports commissioned, and recommendations delayed. Each step forward was met with amendments, exceptions, and compromises. Reform was framed not as a moral necessity, but as a technical challenge requiring endless study. Meanwhile, the cost of delay was paid daily by ordinary people. Illness continued. Children grew up weakened by poor diets. Productivity suffered, ironically, undermining the very efficiency manufacturers claimed to protect. The contradiction became harder to ignore. A system designed to feed the nation was quietly harming it. Women reformers played a crucial role, particularly those involved in public health and household education. They reframed the issue not as abstract chemistry or commerce, but as a question of family welfare. Pamphlets explained how adulteration affected children's growth, mothers' health, and household budgets. By connecting food reform to domestic responsibility, they expanded the movement's reach beyond scientific circles. Journalists amplified these efforts. Publishing exposes that named companies, detailed methods, and described suffering in vivid terms. Serialized articles kept the issue alive in public consciousness, making it harder for officials to dismiss. The press became a battleground, with industry-funded responses competing against investigative reporting. Truth, for the first time, had a platform that rivaled profit. Gradually, the language of debate began to shift. Regulation was no longer discussed solely as interference, but as protection. The idea that commerce should be free from all restraint lost some of its force in the face of clear harm. Even some manufacturers, sensing the changing tide, began to support limited oversight, hoping to shape it from within rather than have it imposed upon them. Still, resistance did not vanish. Every proposed law sparked renewed opposition, warnings of economic collapse, and predictions of unintended consequences. Progress came not in dramatic victories, but in incremental gain-small clauses added. Narrow definitions expanded, enforcement mechanisms cautiously introduced. The fight for reform was not a single battle, but a long campaign of persistence. By this stage, the question was no longer whether adulteration existed, but how long society could tolerate it. The tension between profit and public health had been exposed, and it could not be neatly resolved. Food, once a private matter of taste and habit, had become a public issue demanding collective responsibility. The outcome of this struggle was still uncertain. Powerful interests remained entrenched, and laws on paper did not always translate into change on the ground. But something fundamental had shifted. The idea that food producers owed a duty to the people they fed had entered public consciousness sand once planted. That idea could not easily be removed. The fight for reform was far from over. It would face setbacks, compromises, and disappointments. Yet the foundations had been laid for a reckoning that would reshape how society understood food, responsibility, and the limits of commerce. What followed would test whether those foundations were strong enough to hold. The adulteration acts, slowly, almost reluctantly, the machinery of politics began to turn. 4 years, evidence had piled up on parliamentary desks, medical reports thick with statistics, laboratory analysis filled with unfamiliar chemical names, testimonies from doctors, inspectors, and grieving families. What once could be dismissed as isolated scandal or exaggerated complaint now formed an undeniable pattern. The food supply of an industrial nation had been compromised, and the cost was being paid in sickness, weakness, and silent death. Political will did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated, shaped by pressure, embarrassment, and the growing realization that inaction carried its own dangers. Early attempts at legislation were timid and flawed. Initial food adulteration acts, passed in the mid-19th century, sounded promising on paper but proved weak in practice. They relied heavily on local enforcement, offered vague definitions of adulteration, and imposed penalties so minor that many manufacturers treated them as trivial inconveniences. Worse still, the burden of proof often fell on consumers or local authorities with little funding and even less technical expertise. The laws existed, but they lacked teeth. Despite these shortcomings, something important had changed. For the first time, the state had acknowledged that food safety was not merely a private concern, but a public responsibility. This principle, once established, became difficult to reverse. Each failure of enforcement, each loophole exploited by dishonest traders, strengthened the argument for stronger, clearer laws. Reformers learned from every weakness, refining their demands with greater precision. By the early 1870s, pressure intensified. Industrial Britain had reached a level of complexity where informal trust and market self-regulation were no longer viable. Food traveled long distances, passed through countless intermediaries, and was transformed repeatedly before reaching the consumer. The average citizen had no meaningful way to know what they were eating. This reality made regulation not an intrusion, but a necessity as safeguard in a system too vast and opaque to police itself. The 18th Food Adulteration Act emerged from this context as a turning point. It did not appear fully formed or uncontested. Debates were fierce and prolonged. Manufacturers warned once again of rising prices and collapsing trade. Some politicians feared backlash from powerful commercial interests. Others worried about administrative burden and costs. Yet the weight of evidence, combined with growing public awareness, made outright opposition increasingly difficult to justify. One of the Act's most significant achievements was clarity. It defined adulteration more precisely, removing the ambiguity that had previously shielded offenders. Mixing harmful substances into food was no longer a gray area or a matter of interpretation. It was explicitly illegal. Equally important, the Act shifted focus from intent to effect. Whether a seller meant to deceive mattered less than whether the food sold was unsafe or falsely represented. Enforcement mechanisms were local authorities were given clearer powers to appoint inspectors and analysts. Standards for testing were formalized, reducing the ability of defendants to challenge results on technical grounds. Penalties increased, making violations financially and reputationally costly. For the first time, habitual offenders faced the possibility of serious consequences, not just minor fines. The psychological impact of the Act was as important as its legal provisions. It sent a message that the era of unchecked adulteration was coming to an end. Honest traders, long undercut by dishonest competitors, welcomed the change. For them, regulation promised not restriction, but fairness, a level playing field, where quality was not punished and deception was no longer rewarded. Public reaction was cautiously optimistic. Newspapers reported the passage of the Act as a victory for common sense and public health. Reformers celebrated, though many remained wary. They understood that laws alone did not guarantee change. Enforcement depended on funding, political commitment, and continued public interest. Still, the Act represented something reformers had sought for decades: official recognition that the state had a duty to protect citizens from invisible harm. In working-class neighborhoods, the effects were not immediate, but they were felt. Inspectors began to appear in markets and shops, collecting samples and asking questions. Some vendors cleaned up their practices quickly, fearing prosecution. Others tested the limits of enforcement, substituting one additive for another, hoping to stay just within legal boundaries. The culture of deception did not vanish overnight, but it was disrupted. For women managing households, the act offered a measure of reassurance. While it did not eliminate the need for caution or thrift, it suggested that the burden of vigilance might not rest entirely on their shoulders. The responsibility for food safety was beginning to shift away from individual consumers and toward the system itself. A profound change in how risk and responsibility were distributed. Manufacturers adapted in complex ways. Some invested in better ingredients and processes, using compliance as a marketing advantage. Others lobbied quietly for favorable interpretations of the law or delayed implementation in certain regions. Legal expertise became as important as chemical knowledge, as companies sought to navigate the new regulatory landscape without sacrificing profit. The act also influenced scientific practice. Public analysts gained status and legitimacy, their work now embedded in law rather than advocacy alone. Standardized testing encouraged consistency and collaboration, laying the groundwork for modern food science. Knowledge that once circulated only among specialists became part of governance, shaping policy decisions and enforcement priorities. Critics remained. Some argued that the act did not go far enough, allowing too many exceptions or failing to address nutritional quality beyond outright harm. Others warned that enforcement would be uneven, benefiting wealthier districts more than poorer ones. These criticisms were not unfounded, and reformers continued to push for improvement. But even critics acknowledged that the 1875 Act marked a decisive shift. Perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The passage of the Food Adulteration Act altered how society thought about food. It challenged the assumption that appearance equaled quality and that market success equaled safety. It introduced the idea that unseen processes mattered, that what happened before food reached the table was as important as what happened in the kitchen. The law also set a precedent beyond food. It demonstrated that industrial products affecting everyday life could and should be regulated in the interest of public health. This logic would later extend to housing, working conditions, and environmental safety. In this sense, the act was part of a broader transformation in the relationship between citizens, commerce, and the state. Yet the story was far from complete. Laws could be ignored, inspectors could be bribed or overworked, and new forms of adulteration could emerge. The forces that had created the problem, profit pressure, mass demand, and technological change, had not disappeared. They had merely encountered resistance. As the act came into force, optimism mixed with uncertainty. Would enforcement be consistent? Would political will endure once public attention shifted elsewhere? Would manufacturers comply genuinely or merely adapt their methods? These questions lingered, unanswered, shaping the next phase of the struggle. What was clear, however, was that a line had been drawn. The state had stepped into the realm of everyday nourishment, declaring that some practices were no longer acceptable, no matter how profitable they might be. The adulteration of food had moved from being an unfortunate reality of industrial life to a recognized social wrong. The passing of the Adulteration Acts did not end the story, it changed its direction. What followed would test whether laws could transform habits, whether oversight could keep pace with industry, and whether the promise of safer food would reach those who needed it most. The groundwork had been laid, but the outcome remained uncertain, waiting to be shaped by the years ahead. The dawn of honesty. The laws were not perfect, and no one pretended that they were. They arrived burdened with compromises, soft language, and practical limitations that reflected years of resistance and negotiation. Yet for all their flaws, they carried something revolutionary. Power. For the first time, local authorities were no longer expected merely to observe or warn. They were empowered to act. Inspectors could collect samples, analysts could testify with legal backing, and magistrates could impose penalties that actually mattered. The era in which dishonesty was cheap had begun to fade. At first, enforcement felt tentative. Local councils hesitated, unsure how far they could go without provoking backlash from influential traders. Inspectors were few, often underpaid, and sometimes openly mocked by shopkeepers who had grown accustomed to impunity. But the difference now was simple and decisive. The law stood behind them. Each inspection carried the possibility of prosecution, and each prosecution sent a signal that the rules had changed. The earliest cases were watched closely. When a baker was fined for adulterated flour, or a milk seller prosecuted for dilution and chemical additives, newspapers reported the outcomes with keen interest. These were not dramatic trials, but their impact rippled outward. Vendors who had never been caught before began to reconsider their practices. The calculation shifted. What had once been a low-risk shortcut now carried the danger of public exposure, financial loss, and reputational damage. For dishonest traders, this new reality was unsettling. Many had built their businesses on the assumption that adulteration was normal, even necessary. They had learned their methods from predecessors and peers, not from written manuals, and had never faced serious consequences. Now, suddenly, the quiet routines of deception were interrupted by inspectors at the door, samples taken without warning, and letters summoning them to court. The old excuses no longer worked. Local authorities, too, underwent a transformation. Councils that had once avoided confrontation discovered that enforcement brought unexpected support. Ordinary citizens, long suspicious but powerless, welcomed visible action. Complaints increased not out of fear, but out of confidence that reporting might finally matter. The relationship between communities and local governance subtly shifted. Protection, once abstract, became tangible. The courts played a crucial role in this dawn of honesty. Early rulings established precedents that clarified how the laws would be interpreted. Judges who took food safety seriously sent a clear message. Ignorance was no defense, and custom was no excuse. When fines escalated or licenses were revoked, the deterrent effect spread quickly. Word traveled faster than official notices ever could. Not all resistance disappeared. Some traders attempted to outmaneuver the law, altering formulas just enough to remain technically compliant while preserving profit. Others targeted districts with weaker enforcement, exploiting regional disparities. But even these tactics revealed something. Need to evade the law itself proved that the balance of power had shifted. Compliance, once optional, had become unavoidable. For honest vendors, the change was liberating. Bakers who used real flour, dairy sellers who refused to dilute milk, and confectioners who avoided toxic dyes had long struggled to compete with cheaper, adulterated goods. Now, for the first time, integrity offered a chance at survival. The law did not merely punish dishonesty, it rewarded honesty by reducing unfair competition. This effect was subtle but transformative. Consumers noticed changes, even if they did not immediately understand them. Food began to look less uniform, less artificially perfect. Bread varied in color and texture. Milk spoiled faster. Sweets lost some of their unnatural brilliance. At first, these changes sparked suspicion had quality declined. Gradually, however, understanding grew. Imperfection became associated with authenticity, and sameness with deceit. Inspectors became familiar figures rather than intruders. Their presence in markets and shops normalized the idea that food production was subject to oversight. This visibility mattered. It reminded vendors that the law was not theoretical, and it reassured customers that protection did not end at the printed page. Enforcement, even when imperfect, changed daily behavior through expectation alone. The cost of being caught poisoning customers rose steadily. Fines cut into profits. Court appearances disrupted business. Public notices damaged reputations built over years. In some cases, imprisonment loomed, not often imposed, but always threatening. For many traders, the arithmetic no longer worked. The risk outweighed the reward. Dishonesty, once the easiest option, became the most dangerous. This shift marked a cultural turning point. Commerce began, slowly, to accept that some practices were beyond negotiation. The idea that profit justified all methods weakened under legal pressure. Food ceased to be just another commodity and began to be treated as a matter of public trust. This was not a sudden moral awakening, but a practical adaptation to a new environment where rules could no longer be ignored. Local analysts and chemists gained authority alongside inspectors. Their work, once dismissed as theoretical or alarmist, became central to enforcement. Laboratories were modest, but their findings carried weight. A few drops of reagent, a change in color, a line in a report, these small acts translated into legal consequences. Science, quietly, became a tool of justice. Yet the dawn of honesty was uneven. Some regions enforced the law rigorously, others hesitated or lacked resources. Corruption did not vanish overnight. Personal connections still influenced outcomes. But even these imperfections existed within a changed framework. Failures were now failures to enforce a known standard, not failures to imagine one. That distinction mattered. For families, the effects accumulated slowly. Fewer unexplained illnesses, fewer children weakened by daily meals. Trust, though cautious, began to return. Meals were no longer shadowed by the same quiet dread. The kitchen did not become a place of certainty, but it became less of a gamble. Manufacturers adapted in public ways as well. Labels became more informative. Claims of purity and quality multiplied, some sincere, others strategic. Advertising shifted tone, emphasizing honesty and compliance. Even when exaggerated, these messages reflected the new reality. Safety had become a selling point. The market itself began to reward what the law demanded. This period did not erase the memory of betrayal. Many remembered too well how long deception had gone unchallenged. But memory served a purpose. It sharpened vigilance and discouraged complacency. Citizens who had once been passive consumers became more questioning, more willing to report concerns, more aware of their rights. The dawn of honesty did not mean the sun was fully risen. Shadows remained. New technologies and additives would introduce fresh challenges, and enforcement would always lag behind innovation. But the direction had changed. The system was no longer drifting aimlessly. It was being steered, however imperfectly, toward accountability. Most importantly, the idea that poisoning customers was simply how business was done lost its legitimacy. The law had redrawn the boundaries of acceptable conduct. What had once been defended as a trade secret was now recognized as a public harm. This redefinition altered not just behavior, but expectations of producers, of authorities, and of society itself. The change was quiet, unfolding in court records, inspection logs, and altered routines. But its significance was profound. A society that had tolerated invisible harm for decades had begun, at last, to resist it with more than words. The tools were imperfect, the progress incomplete, but the cost of dishonesty had finally become real. And with that realization, a fragile but genuine transformation took hold. The era of casual poisoning did not end all at once, but it no longer passed unnoticed what followed would depend on whether this new vigilance could be sustained, whether honesty could survive the return of complacency, and whether the lessons learned at such a high price would endure beyond the generation that had paid it. A hard-won victory. It took decades, far longer than anyone had hoped, and far longer than countless families could afford to establish even the most basic standard of food safety. The victory, when it finally came into view, did not arrive with celebration or sudden relief. There were no parades, no dramatic turning point where danger vanished overnight. Instead, it emerged slowly, unevenly, shaped by exhaustion as much as determination. By the time standards were enforced with any consistency, millions had already suffered in silence, their weakened bodies forming the unseen foundation upon which reform was built. This victory was hard-won, precisely because the suffering that demanded it was so quiet. Food adulteration rarely killed in spectacular ways. It did not announce itself with explosions or epidemics that forced immediate action. It worked gradually, eroding health day by day, meal by meal. Children grew smaller and weaker than they should have been. Adults tired more quickly, fell ill more often, and recovered more slowly. Death certificates rarely named food as the cause, but it was there all the same, woven into everyday life. For reformers, this invisibility was the greatest obstacle. How do you fight a danger that leaves no single moment of outrage, no obvious villain at the scene? The answer, painfully, was persistence. Year after year, they gathered evidence, told stories, and pushed against indifference. Many grew old before seeing meaningful change. Some died believing their efforts had failed. The victory that followed belonged as much to those who never lived to witness it as to those who finally did. When food safety standards began to take hold, their effects were subtle at first. Bread became less unnaturally white. Milk spoiled more quickly, but made fewer people ill. Brightly colored sweets lost some of their glow. To the casual observer, these changes might have seemed like a decline in quality, not an improvement. It took time for people to understand that imperfection was a sign of honesty, that food, which looked less perfect, was often safer. Inspectors became a routine presence rather than a novelty. Markets adapted, reluctantly at times, but steadily. Traders learned that deception carried real risk, not just moral criticism. The threat of fines, closures, and public exposure altered behavior in ways sermons and pamphlets never could. Compliance was not universal, but it was no longer optional. A line had been drawn, and crossing it now had consequences. This shift marked a defining moment in the history of public health. For the first time, the state had accepted responsibility for protecting citizens from dangers embedded in ordinary life. Food safety standards acknowledged that health was not solely a matter of personal choice or moral character. It was shaped by systems, by supply chains, manufacturing practices, and economic pressures beyond individual control. This recognition changed how society understood both illness and responsibility. The victory was not only legal, but cultural. Trust, once broken, began slowly to rebuild, not blindly, but cautiously. Consumers became more aware, more questioning. Labels mattered. Sources mattered. The idea that food could be tested, verified, and regulated entered the public imagination. This was a profound shift from an earlier world where buyers relied almost entirely on appearance and reputation. Yet even as standards improved, memories of suffering lingered. Older generations remembered a time when food was something to fear as much as to desire. Parents who had lost children to unexplained illnesses did not forget. Their stories became warnings, passed down quietly, reminding others why these protections mattered. The victory carried a weight of grief that no law could erase. It also carried compromise. Standards were basic, not ideal. They focused on preventing the most obvious harms, not on guaranteeing nutrition or fairness. Many unsafe practices disappeared, but others survived in altered forms. Enforcement varied by region, influenced by funding, politics, and local will. The victory was real, but incomplete, strong enough to matter, yet fragile enough to require constant defense. Industries adapted, as they always had. Some embraced safety as part of their identity, investing in better methods and marketing trust as a selling point. Others complied minimally, doing only what the law demanded. The relationship between commerce and regulation settled into an uneasy balance, shaped by negotiation rather than resolution. The struggle between profit and protection did not end. It simply changed terrain. For the working class, the impact was gradual but meaningful. Fewer children fell mysteriously ill. Diets, though still limited, became marginally more nourishing. Life remained hard, but it was no longer quietly poisoned at its most basic level. This improvement rarely made headlines, but it mattered deeply to those who lived it. Survival became just a little less uncertain. Public health professionals looked back on this period as a lesson written in suffering. It demonstrated that waiting for absolute proof costs lives, that economic arguments can delay necessary action, and that invisible harms are no less real for being slow. These lessons would shape future responses to threats that were similarly gradual and contested in safe working conditions. Polluted water, contaminated air, importantly, the victory reframed the role of government. Protection from harm was no longer limited to dramatic crises or overt violence. It extended into kitchens, markets, and factories, in the mundane spaces where life was sustained. This expansion of responsibility would later underpin broader social reforms, linking health to housing, labor, and the environment. Still, the cost of delay haunted the reformers who survived to see change. They knew how much suffering could have been prevented had action come sooner. They knew that many arguments used to resist regulation had been recycled endlessly, even when evidence was overwhelming. The victory felt necessary, but not triumphant. It carried with it a sense of reckoning rather than celebration. In hindsight, this moment stands as a dividing line. Before it, food safety was largely a matter of luck, trust, and appearance. After it, safety became something that could be demanded, tested, and enforced, however imperfectly. That shift altered expectations permanently. Once people had experienced even minimal protection, returning to the old indifference became unthinkable. The story of this victory is therefore not one of sudden enlightenment, but of endurance. It was built from countless small acts: a chemist publishing results, a journalist refusing to drop a story, a parent asking an uncomfortable question, an inspector taking one more sample. None of these acts alone changed the system. Together, over decades, they made neglect harder to justify. This defining moment in public health history reminds us that progress often arrives too late for many, and never as fully as hoped. Yet, it also shows that systems can change, even when resistance is powerful and suffering is hidden. Standards that seem obvious in hindsight were once radical demands, dismissed as unrealistic or dangerous. As the era of blatant adulteration slowly receded, it left behind more than safer food. It left a warning etched into collective memory that everyday necessities can become instruments of harm when profit goes unchecked, and that protection is rarely granted willingly yet must be demanded, argued for, and defended over generations. The victory was real, but it was not the end of the story. It was a foundation, laid with difficulty and loss, upon which future protections would be built. What remained was the challenge of preserving that foundation, strengthening it, and remembering the price paid to create it. Cause forgetting, history had shown, was always the first step toward repeating the same silent suffering once again. Closing reflection. So, as you settle deeper into your own quiet night, when the noise of the day has faded and the world feels briefly at rest, it is worth remembering this. The comfort of knowing what is truly in your food is not natural, automatic, or guaranteed. It is a hard-won luxury. It exists because generations before you endured uncertainty at every meal, swallowing not only hunger, but hidden danger. What now feels ordinary was once a daily gamble, played out on kitchen tables and street corners, where bread and sweets became silent battlegrounds for human dignity. In the modern moment, food often feels distant from struggle, wrapped, labeled, regulated, and standardized. It arrives with an assurance that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. We debate preferences, diets, and convenience, rarely questioning whether our daily bread might weaken us rather than sustain us. That confidence is the final outcome of a long, painful history, one written not in grand victories, but in small protections slowly assembled against resistance, denial, and profit. The people who suffered during the era of adulteration rarely knew the true cause of their pain. They blamed exhaustion, poverty, bad air, or fate. Children cried through stomach aches that were never properly explained. Parents mourned losses they believed unavoidable. Workers pushed their bodies beyond reason, unaware that the food meant to fuel them was quietly failing them. Their suffering was real, but it was also invisible, spread thinly across millions of lives rather than concentrated in a single catastrophe. And yet, from that invisibility emerged something enduring. Outrage did not come easily, nor did reform. It had to be taught, demonstrated, argued, and defended. It required people to imagine that something as familiar as bread could be dangerous, and that danger could be intentional. It required society to accept an uncomfortable truth, that markets, left unchecked, do not automatically protect the vulnerable, and that progress without accountability can become its own form of harm. The legacy of that realization surrounds us now. Every inspection, every standard, every test is an echo of earlier neglect. Each rule exists because someone once argued it was unnecessary, too expensive, or an intrusion. Each protection marks a boundary that had to be fought for, often against powerful interests determined to preserve the freedom to deceive. The safety you rarely notice is the product of conflict, not convenience. There is a temptation to see this history as settled, a problem solved once and for all. But history rarely works that way. The story of food adulteration teaches a quieter lesson, that dignity is most often defended in ordinary places against ordinary harms. and that the erosion of standards begins long before disaster is visible. The danger was never just poison, it was indifference. It was the willingness to accept quiet suffering as the price of efficiency. When we forget this, protections begin to feel negotiable. Oversight becomes bureaucracy. Regulation becomes burden. The language used to defend adulteration returns in new forms, dressed in modern terms, but driven by familiar logic, profit pressures, competition, and distance between producer and consumer still exist. The battlegrounds may have shifted, but the underlying tension remains. The comfort you feel tonight knowing that your food is unlikely to harm you is therefore not just a personal convenience. It is a collective achievement. It rests on the memory of those who endured meals filled with uncertainty, and on the insistence that such uncertainty was unacceptable. It reflects a moment in history when society decided that survival was not enough, and that safety, honesty, and transparency mattered. There is dignity in that decision. It affirms that human lives are worth more than margins, and that nourishment should strengthen rather than diminish. It acknowledges that health is not solely a matter of individual responsibility, but of shared systems and shared obligations. This idea, once radical, now feels self-evident proof of how deeply it has reshaped our expectations. As the night grows quieter, it is worth sitting with the simplicity of this truth. The loaf of bread on your table carries a history far heavier than its weight. The sweets once colored with poison now arrive restrained by rules written in response to grief. What you eat connects you to countless lives lived before yours, lives that absorbed the cost of learning. What happens when safety is left to chance? The era when food was a hidden threat has passed, but not because danger vanished on its own. It passed because people noticed, questioned, and refused to accept silence as an answer. Their success was incomplete, imperfect, and often delayed, but it was real. And in that reality lies a responsibility to remember, not to live in fear, but in awareness, not to romanticize the past, but to recognize the effort required to escape it. Comfort, after all, is fragile when its origins are forgotten. The quiet certainty you now enjoy was never inevitable. It was built slowly, through suffering that rarely made history books, but shaped everyday life. So let this reflection settle gently, like the close of a long story told at night. The battles over bread and sweets were never just about food. They were about whose lives mattered, whose voices were heard, and whether harm that arrived quietly was still worth stopping. The answer, hard won and costly, was yes. And that answer remains with you, now, in every ordinary meal, in every unnoticed protection, in every moment of trust you place in what sustains you. That trust is the legacy, quiet, unseen, and earned at a terrible price. The story ends here, but its meaning does not